One of the questions we left unanswered in the introduction was this: how does ASP.NET know how to deliver a request, like /home/index, to our home controller? The answer is in the routing engine that is a core part of ASP.NET. That is, the routing engine isn't tied to MVC. You can use the routing engine to route requests to web forms, WCF services, really any type of resource. But in MVC applications, we primarily use routes to direct requests to our controllers. To do this, we give the routing engine a map to follow using a map route API. A route map allows us to provide a friendly name for a route, a pattern for the route, and default parameters for a route. The most important pieces to look at are the pattern and the defaults. Think about the goal of the routing engine. Its job is to basically examine a URL and pick it apart into distinct pieces of data. In an MVC application, we want the URL to specify the controller and action to invoke, and perhaps some other data, so we give the routing engine a pattern it can apply to find these parameters in the URL. The words inside those curly braces will be the parameter names. If the routing engine doesn't find a specific piece of data in the URL, it can use one of the default values that we specify in the parameter defaults. Let's switch into Visual Studio and experiment with this. Inside of Visual Studio, let me introduce you to the global.asax.cs file. This is a bit of a magical file in ASP.NET. It has a class derived from HTTP application, and it allows us to hook into application level events like application start. This method will be magically invoked by ASP.NET before you process the first HTTP request. So it allows us to put all the configuration in place that we need, including registering our routes for the routing engine. We do this by passing in the global routes collection of the route table. And here's the code that you saw on that previous slide. We're walking up to that routes collection and say, let's map a new route. We'll call it default. And here's the type of URL you're going to look for. So if you see something come in that looks like /home/index, then treat home as the controller name, index as the action name, and we don't have an ID, but that's okay. We'll provide a default value for it. And in fact, if you don't see an action name, that's okay too, because we're going to provide a default action name of index. This value gets bundled up into a data structure and gets passed along to ASP.NET MVC, who can then look at it and say, what did you find for a controller? And what did you find for an action? And then it can use that information to direct the request to our controller. In fact, that same information is available to us. It's available throughout the request. Let's go into the home controller. And instead of having our message be welcome to ASP.NET MVC, let's put together some information that we find in the routing engine. All these routing engine values are available through a route data property that's available in our controller that will have values, and you can look into the values and say something like, what is the controller parameter that you find? That name, controller, has to match with the name that you specified inside of this pattern. So let's do this. Let's actually put together some text that will include the controller, action, and ID parameter. I'll do a string.format, and we can say take parameter 0, parameter 1, parameter 2, and what we'll pass in here is route data.values controller, route data.values action, and route data.values ID. Let's run the application and see what comes out. And you can see that just by hitting the root URL of our application, just /, then we got the values home and index out of here. If we go to /home, we still end up at the same place, home index. We can say home index explicitly. We could also say home index 3, and we get the value 3 in as an ID parameter. What we're going to see in just a little bit is that it's actually very easy to get that ID parameter. We don't have to look inside of route values explicitly. But for right now, I just want to demonstrate that the whole goal of the routing engine is to pick apart that URL and pass along the data that it found inside of the URL into MVC, and then that data is available to us inside of our controller. Even inside of a view, you have a route data collection. Typically, our code is not going to be looking into route values like this. It's the MVC framework using route values to at least find the controller to instantiate and the action to invoke. And notice there is another convention in play here. When the route engine says the controller data is equal to home, the MVC framework will instantiate the class named homeController. So the framework is basically appending the word controller to the name and then looking for a type that matches. You might also notice that this is a case-insensitive search.